You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
It's back to school season, and Clorox is donating 2 million disinfecting wipes to classrooms across America. Because back to school means things can get a little bit messy. Just ask second grade teacher Mr. Torres.
Put me and just one Clorox wipe on a team? We can take on crayon smudges, sticky fingerprints on every surface, sneezes on the door handle, juice box explosion by the sink, snack crumbs, and don't even get me started on the bathroom passes.
Clorox disinfecting wipes. Teacher's #1 wipe.
Think about it. Bathroom passes.
Clean feels good. Based on unit sales data.
Ever since Britain took control of Palestine from the Ottoman Empire during World War I and developed its close relationship with the Jewish communities there, supporting the idea of the establishment of a Jewish state there with American consent, a special relationship has existed between Israel and the West. Following Britain's withdrawal and the founding of the modern State of Israel in 1948, the country has served as a projection of Western power and liberal democracy into the Middle East, and as such, it has benefited from an unusual level of economic support, especially from the USA. While the claim that America is a client state of Israel is just grossly false and partakes of the anti-Semitic tropes of the very old and long-debunked international Jewish conspiracy claims, it is no exaggeration or oversimplification to call Israel a client nation of the U.S. A common point emphasized by pro-Palestinian protesters is that the U.S. government funds or subsidizes Israeli military action. And the simple fact of America's long history of military support to Israel makes that an undeniable truth. For the first decade or so after Israel's independence, the U.S. and other nations who were offering the new state aid limited their contributions to economic support for fear of alienating the oil-producing Arab states that saw Israel as a threat. It was America that broke this embargo in the 1960s, when JFK authorized the direct sale of arms to the country. France actually became the biggest provider of military aid to Israel, but in 1967, when yet another in a series of wars between Israel and surrounding Arab states broke out, they imposed a new military embargo, leading to a 450% increase in U.S. military aid. In the early 1970s, with U.S. leadership viewing Israel as a bulwark against the spread of communism, military aid was dramatically increased again, more than doubling from the hundreds of millions to more than $1 billion. In 1973, in response to another Arab-Israeli conflict, Congress approved a further doubling to more than $2 billion. If you're doing the math, this is what you call an exponential increase. But then an interesting change in this pattern occurred in 1975 under Republican President Gerald Ford. Frustrated with what he perceived as Israeli inflexibility during peace negotiations with Egypt after the Yom Kippur War, his administration declared that the collapse of the talks meant, quote, an immediate reassessment of U.S. policy in the area, including our relations with Israel, end quote. Ford stated that the U.S. should not, quote, isolate itself from the rest of the world to stand behind Israeli intransigence, end quote. He immediately froze arms shipments to Israel and directed every department of his administration to deprioritize Israeli concerns. But this quote-unquote reassessment crisis passed when an anti-communist coalition of senators pressured him to reverse course, and since that time, the exponential growth of military aid to Israel has continued. Cumulatively, Israel has received more American aid than any other country in U.S. history, more than $300 billion worth, and 78% of their arms are provided by the U.S. Jimmy Carter quadrupled the aid, and Reagan emphasized our quote-unquote special relationship so much that he stopped considering our economic assistance loans and declared them to be grants, freely given.
The United States will soon be giving Israel military aid on a grant, not a loan basis. We have restructured our 1985 foreign aid package, and Israel will now receive economic aid totaling $850 million and a military grant of some $1.4 billion. All in all, the friendship between Israel and the United States is closer and stronger today than ever before, and I intend to keep it that way.
So special is this relationship that criticism of Israel, or the aid we provide them, came to be viewed by many as certain political suicide, which contributed to today's conflation of criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. Since Ford's brief flirtation with reassessment, the only time that another U.S. president showed signs of reassessing was last year, when Biden briefly paused the shipment of bombs to discourage Netanyahu from dropping them on civilians. A clear-eyed and honest look at the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, leading up to the devastating war and humanitarian crisis today, should give any realist reason enough for a new reassessment of this special relationship. This is Historical Blindness. I'm Nathaniel Lloyd, and I understand that listener views may differ from mine on this topic, but I trust you'll listen all the way through for a clear sense of my position. Thank you for listening to A New Reassessment, Realism on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Before I continue this episode, I want to thank all my patrons. Even if my take on this topic isn't quite what you expected, I hope you'll recognize that it was earnestly thought through and continue your support. Patrons of the show get access to an exclusive RSS feed with ad-free versions of the show, early release of episodes, teasers, and exclusive minisodes between every main release, making this a weekly podcast for patrons on Patreon. If you hear minisodes and think they're little blurbs or insubstantial sound bites, think again. They're fully researched and produced episodes, anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes long, and they tie in with the main episode topics. And they even sometimes fill in the gaps and tell the rest of the story that my main episode didn't have time to tell. For example, after my episode on Trump's war on higher learning, I released a minisode on his war on science and research integrity. And after my episode on Project Esther and the weaponization of anti-Semitism, I released one about the origins of Christian Zionism and the Armageddon lobby in America. For listeners who are interested, I also sell these exclusive minisodes for just $3 a pop. So head over to patreon.com/historicalblindness and consider purchasing the occasional blind spot minisode that interests you, or supporting the podcast for as little as $1 a month. Now, let's continue the episode. Welcome to Historical Blindness. In the previous episode, I acknowledged that it has taken me too long to address such an urgent topic, explaining that I struggled to parse this really labyrinthine and dreadful issue, and was also bothered by the thought of contributing to the genuine anti-Semitism that does, as I acknowledged, sometimes arise in rhetoric on the topic. I had listeners continually challenge me on social media and in emails to address the Gaza war and American political support of genocide. But for these reasons, I kicked the can down the road, which I regret. Another reason I was reluctant to devote an episode to this topic during the election last year was that I was unsettled by my perception that the Palestinian solidarity movement in America was actually helping Donald Trump to win, even though Kamala Harris would undoubtedly have been a better president for the Palestinian cause than Trump is. I found it troubling that pro-Palestinian protesters were following Harris on the campaign trail, interrupting her rallies, and, along with many bots, I'm sure, filling social media comment threads with assertions that Biden and she were supporters of genocide. As the cold open of this episode makes abundantly clear, I understand the reasoning behind these protests, in that I recognize the unique client relationship between the U.S. government and Israel, particularly when it comes to military aid. I also acknowledged that the Gaza war started while Biden was president, and for months, while Palestinian bodies piled up, it was Biden who continued providing the same military support without conditions. In March 2024, he even signed a spending package that included a provision to cut off funding to relief organizations, thereby further enabling Netanyahu to block aid to Gaza. Based on these facts, it made some real sense for the Palestinian solidarity movement to protest Biden. But the reality is that Pew Research indicates Democrats generally are far more likely than Republicans to criticize Israel's approach to the Gaza war. And voting records show that legislation for providing military support to Israel during the war, like the Israel Security Assistance Support Act, was overwhelmingly supported and passed by Republicans over the nay votes of Democrats. Even the very mainstream and centrist Democratic leader Chuck Schumer publicly called for new elections in Israel and a change of leadership, saying Netanyahu has lost his way. And in April of 2024, Democratic representatives finally pressured Biden to place conditions on further support to Israel, marking the biggest shift in U.S. relations with Israel since Ford's 1975 quote-unquote reassessment of the relationship. And it was Democrats who then pressured Biden to drop out of the presidential race. Meanwhile, Trump has continually proven himself a far closer ally of Netanyahu than Biden ever was. Netanyahu praises Trump, adopts his rhetoric by calling unfavorable news fake, labeling any criticism a witch hunt, and even calling for the building of a southern border wall in Israel. In return, Trump has given Netanyahu everything he wants, officially recognizing Israeli claims to the disputed city of Jerusalem as their national capital, moving the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal, and ignoring the Palestinian conflict in his mediation of Arab-Israeli diplomacy. He calls himself Israel's best friend, and Netanyahu has called him the same.
I think President Trump is the greatest friend that Israel has ever had in the White House. I've said this before, I'll say it again. You are the greatest friend Israel has ever had in the White House. I've said, and I'm going to repeat it again, President Trump is the greatest friend that Israel has ever had in the White House.
Trump himself certainly didn't take any strong stand against Netanyahu's conduct of the war in Gaza, saying only weakly and somewhat cryptically that it looks bad, so they should, quote, finish it up, end quote.
Israel has to do what they have to do, but we have to get to peace because the world is turning, and it's not a good thing for Israel. You have to finish up your war. You have to finish it up. You got to get it done. And I'm sure you'll do that.
Trump has even gone so far as to say all Democrats, quote-unquote, hate Israel. He said it in 2019, and he said it again during last year's campaign after Schumer's call for change. He could not have more clearly been allying himself with Netanyahu. And yet, when Kamala Harris entered the race, she too became the principal target of pro-Palestinian protests, despite the record showing that Harris was actually urging Biden to act on behalf of Palestinian civilians since 2023. And despite her strong public stance that the humanitarian crisis in Gaza needs to end, which she expressed directly to Netanyahu.
I also expressed with the Prime Minister my serious concern about the scale of human suffering in Gaza, including the death of far too many innocent civilians. And I made clear my serious concern about the dire humanitarian situation there, with over 2 million people facing high levels of food insecurity, and 500,000 people facing catastrophic levels of acute food insecurity. What has happened in Gaza over the past 9 months is devastating. The images of dead children and desperate, hungry people fleeing for safety, sometimes displaced for the second, third, or fourth time. We cannot look away in the face of these tragedies. We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering and I will not be silent.
I understand that sometimes it may be more effective to ignore the party who will do nothing for you and instead protest the party that might actually care about your cause and act on it to bring you into their coalition. Just as in 2012, young undocumented immigrants or dreamers and their advocates demonstrated outside Obama's White House instead of protesting at immigration hardliner Mitt Romney's campaign rallies. They knew Obama was amenable to their cause, and indeed Obama did respond, issuing an executive order protecting dreamers. Even after Obama had done more for them than Romney ever would have, the protests over deportation continued to follow Obama, but again, that is valid. Obama won re-election. It was his administration's continuing deportations they wanted to protest. The problem last year was that protesters seemed to view Harris as an enemy rather than as their most likely ally, even when she reached out and made clear that she took their cause seriously.
There is a yearning in our country for a president who will see you, who gets you, and who will fight for you. And listen, hey, on the subject of Gaza, hey guys, I hear you. On the subject of Gaza, we all want this war to end as soon as possible and get the hostages out, and I will do everything in my power to make it so. And let's be clear, we are all here because we are fighting for a democracy and for the right of people to be heard and seen. We're not about the enemy within. We know we are all in this together. That's what we are fighting for.
This dynamic led me to worry that protest of the Gaza war was hurting a candidate that, in my view, was the candidate most likely to sympathize with the Palestinian cause and our only alternative to a fascist threat to democracy. I think that in retrospect, my worries were justified. Post-election polling shows that among those who voted for Biden in 2020 but chose not to vote for Harris in 2024, the majority identified their desire for an end to Israel's violence in Gaza as their principal reason for not voting Democrat. We have every reason to believe, then, that this protest movement contributed to Trump's victory, and his second term has certainly proven valid all our fears of his authoritarianism. As for his actions relating to Gaza, he has done little more than continue to occasionally tell his buddy Netanyahu to finish off Gaza while bombing Iran at Netanyahu's behest. He even floated the heinous idea of driving all Palestinians out of Gaza so he could commercially develop it into a seaside resort like the French Riviera. I would ask where all the massive campus protests against Trump are now, not just over his mass deportations and everything else, but for this issue, over his support of Netanyahu's continual worsening of the situation in Gaza. But I think Trump's fascistic suppression of dissent everywhere goes a long way toward explaining the decline of these protests. As the Palestinian students composing their statement at Harvard on October 7th recognized, the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict is long, so long that it is tempting to gloss over or focus only on recent episodes. But we cannot view the current war as simply a response to October 7th, when these are just the latest escalations in a nearly century-long conflict. A complete overview of the entire conflict's history, even if I can only provide the basic outline of one, is necessary for a clear perspective. The Israel-Palestine conflict is incredibly complex, and this is precisely because its history is as contested and disregarded as the territories and people in the region. One skeptical thinker whom I otherwise respect, Sam Harris, has been a vocal supporter of Israel, blaming the humanitarian crisis in Gaza only on Hamas. Quote, "The proximate cause of this suffering is not merely Israeli bombs," end quote, as he put it in a recent blog post. Quote, "It is the millenarian nihilism of Hamas," end quote. But in making his case, he argues that, quote, the history of the Middle East is of no relevance to me, end quote. And, quote, debating discrepant accounts of this history would be a waste of time, end quote. This I reject. We cannot view this conflict as some aberration divorced from the many aggressions that led up to it. So we must look back, not at ancient claims to the land, though I'll have more to say about that in a moment, but at the history of the modern state of Israel with a focus on Gaza. For about 50 years following World War I, the British controlled the region under a mandate granted by the League of Nations. During this period, following the previously mentioned Balfour Declaration that indicated the UK's intention of establishing a Jewish national home, Jewish immigration to mandatory Palestine increased, despite limitations placed on it by the British. Immediately, conflicts between the Arab-Palestinian inhabitants of the region, their British occupiers, and the European Jews flocking to the region and buying up land ensued. The endless cycle of attacks and retaliations began in 1920 at the Battle of Tel Hai, during border disputes associated with the Franco-Syrian War, when Jewish settlers and Bedouin Arabs clashed, leaving several dead on both sides. In 1936, when Jewish numbers had grown to about a third of the population, the murder of 2 Jews by Arabs was followed by retaliatory shootings, and a massive, years-long Palestinian uprising occurred, first as a general strike and then as a peasant-led revolt against British rule. While precipitated by grievances over growing Jewish power, it was principally a conflict between the Palestinian Arabs and the British Army, who put the uprising down brutally, killing around 5,000 Palestinians, according to one calculation. About a decade later, in 1947, as the British Mandate came to its scheduled conclusion, the United Nations announced a plan for the partition of Palestine, dividing it into an Arab state and a Jewish state. While the Jews celebrated the realization of their national home, and Jewish leadership made plans for further expansion beyond the partitions drawn for their new state, the Palestinians rejected the partition because it awarded the Jewish state twice the amount of land as the Arab state, even though the Jewish population was only half that of the Arab population. A civil war ensued, during which massacres were committed on both sides. And in 1948, the Zionist forces went on the offensive, expanding their territories and displacing more than 700,000 Palestinians before declaring independence and establishing the modern state of Israel. With Palestinian refugees overwhelming their countries, the surrounding nations in the Arab League stepped into the fray, attempting to drive Israeli forces out of Palestinian territories. By the time an armistice was reached 10 months later, Israel had seized 60% of the land partitioned by the UN for an Arab state, leaving only the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the 2 Palestinian territories that would become hotly contested areas of conflict for the next 75 years. Now for a brief intermission. Out here in California, it's been a pretty moderate summer so far, and easy to beat the heat. But while you make plans to hit the beach or throw swim parties and stay cool this summer, if you don't make sure you have the right phone plan, you'll still feel the heat, and you might get burned. That's why I gave Mint Mobile a shot, and you should too. I found it had coverage and speed as good as any big carrier. We're talking high-speed data and unlimited talk and text on the nation's largest 5G network, but for way lower prices. For a limited time, Mint Mobile offers 3 months of unlimited premium wireless service for $15 a month, so you can chill instead of sweating over data overages and surprise charges. Bring your phone and phone number and come on in. The water's fine. This year, skip breaking a sweat and breaking the bank. Get this new customer offer and your 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month at mintmobile.com/blindness. That's mintmobile.com/blindness. Upfront payment of $45 required, equivalent to $15 a month. Limited time new customer offer for 3 months only. Speeds may slow above 35 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details. As listeners of Historical Blindness, you're no strangers to the fact that history is a lens through which we can better understand the present. Or as Shakespeare put it, what's past is prologue. History is the indispensable context without which we cannot hope to truly understand current events. You understand that, and so do the creators of the American Scandal podcast. Every season, they immerse listeners in the biggest controversies in U.S. history, helping us understand America's dark side and learn from its troubled past. Its latest season, Ruby Ridge Standoff, delves into an incident that sowed the seeds for the rise of the modern radical right. It transports you to 1992, where in a remote corner of Idaho, federal law enforcement surround a small cabin. They've come for Randy Weaver, a survivalist who took his family to the mountains in anticipation of the apocalypse. A simple weapons charge brought the agents here, but the situation is about to explode into a deadly and tragic standoff that will later become a rallying cry for far-right extremists, fueling distrust and violent anti-government sentiment for decades. Follow American Scandal on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge all episodes of American Scandal's Ruby Ridge Standoff early and ad-free right now on Wondery Plus.
Get ready for back to school with H&M. Enjoy up to 50% off mix and match basics, new denim styles, and more. Find their favorites for in and out of the classroom at your nearest H&M or on hm.com.
Getting ready to step into your career era? Set yourself apart with Adobe Creative Cloud Pro for students. Hone your skills with apps like Photoshop, Illustrator, Premiere Pro, and more, powered with the latest in creative AI. Students save over 55% so you can build a portfolio you're proud of. Launch your future with Adobe Creative Cloud Pro for students. Visit adobe.com/students to learn more.
Now, back to the show. The Gaza Strip and its Palestinian inhabitants have struggled to establish sovereignty since 1947, when the land was allotted to them by the UN. After being driven from the land during the Civil War, the armistice between Israel and the Arab League brought with it some independence under the All-Palestine Protectorate, which was admitted to the Arab League. But during the Suez Crisis in 1956, Israel invaded, and during their occupation, the Israel Defense Forces, or IDF, are alleged to have committed more than one massacre at refugee camps. Under international pressure, Israel pulled out, and Gaza was thereafter occupied by Egypt until the Six-Day War, when it again came under Israeli military administration. Then Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir expelled a further 25,000 Palestinians from Gaza in the following years, invoking the menace of a quote-unquote fifth column as justification, a common excuse for ethnic cleansing. During the ensuing years, the Israeli government did not economically develop the region and even proposed cutting off their water supply, with the hope that if they made it inhospitable enough, Palestinians would just leave of their own accord. This dispossession of the Arab population continued in the 1970s under Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who divided Gaza into 5 military zones to better control its population and allow for Israeli settlement of the region, which he called the Five-Finger Plan. In the late 80s, Palestinians throughout the occupied territories and all over Israel had had enough and staged massive, nonviolent protests called the First Intifada, or Uprising, which included boycotts, strikes, and street demonstrations involving barricades and graffiti. Violence perpetrated by protesters was at first limited to some stone throwing, but in Gaza, within the first year, the IDF shot 77 demonstrators dead and beat another 17 to death. Over the course of 6 years of unrest, more than 1,000 Palestinians were killed, along with around 200 Israelis. In large part as a result of this huge dissent movement, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin came to the negotiation table with the Palestinian Liberation Organization's Yasser Arafat and recognized the Palestinian Authority's jurisdiction over the Gaza Strip in 1994. In 2000, after Rabin's assassination, and after Arafat and new Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak failed to finalize terms for the establishment of a Palestinian state at Camp David, a second intifada erupted with far more violence, claiming the lives of 1,000 Israelis, more than 100 of them children, and around 5,000 Palestinians, nearly 1,000 children. In 2005, under Ariel Sharon again, Israel finally disengaged from the region, ostensibly no longer occupying it, although their absolute control over its border, waters, and airspace meant a continued de facto occupation. It was then that a jihadist group called the Islamic Resistance Movement, abbreviated Hamas, whose 1988 charter made references to Jewish genocide, took control of Gaza's government in a 2007 civil war. It should be pointed out Hamas has since tempered its rhetoric, clarifying that its struggle is against Zionists rather than all Jews. But after the heinous Hamas attacks of October 7, 2023, their anti-Semitism was emphasized by those trying to make sense of the attacks. Ironically, while Hamas has said that not all Jews are their enemies, those who would excuse the current total war of destruction conducted by Netanyahu in retaliation for the Hamas attacks don't distinguish between Hamas and the Palestinian people at large. They attempt to claim that, quote, Palestinians are Hamas, end quote, that the two are indistinguishable because of political support for the militant group in Palestinian territories. But this is a gross oversimplification meant to dehumanize the civilians being killed in Gaza. Palestinians are not united under Hamas. Many support the Fatah Party and its chairman, Mahmoud Abbas. Recent polls indicate support for Hamas among Palestinians results mostly from the notion that they have managed to make the Palestinian plight central to the global political conversation, but that only 40% still want to be governed by them. Regardless, even if that means Hamas continues to win elections by plurality, it doesn't justify exterminating their entire electorate because of the broad support they enjoy. When Hamas first took power in 2007, the Israeli government showed its disapproval and proved that it was still in occupying power by blockading the Gaza Strip, leading to Hamas rocket attacks and Israeli Defense Forces incursions. When ceasefires failed, the first Gaza war erupted for 3 weeks from the end of 2008 to the beginning of 2009, during which nearly 1,500 Palestinians were killed, at least 3/4 of them civilians. On the other side, 13 Israeli combatants were killed, and Hamas rockets killed 3 civilians. Already the Gaza Strip was facing a humanitarian crisis. Infrastructure, like hospitals and huge numbers of homes, were destroyed, leaving many Palestinians homeless and without medical resources. Meanwhile, food and supplies were blockaded, while epidemics swept through the war-torn region. In 2014, 2 Hamas militants abducted and murdered 3 Israeli teens in the West Bank. And when Israel responded by invading West Bank territories, arresting hundreds of Palestinians and killing about a dozen in the process, Hamas launched rockets from Gaza and a new war broke out, during which the IDF invaded and bombarded the Strip, causing further damage to infrastructure and thousands of deaths, mostly, as has always been the case, among Palestinian civilians. Then Trump took office here in the US, and a year into his first term, he formally recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. This was a major insult to the Muslim populations of the region. Jerusalem has always been contested ground, containing important holy sites for both Muslims and Jews, such that the 1947 UN partition would have made of the city an international zone under UN administration. Trump's declaration pleased many Israelis, but it also touched off another major Palestinian uprising called the Great March of Return, protesting this Israeli claim on Jerusalem, as well as the continued blockade of the Gaza Strip, and demanding what they have long demanded, the return of Palestinian refugees to land seized by Israel. The violence during this unrest was even more asymmetrical, with more than 200 Palestinians killed and more than 9,000 injured, while no Israelis were killed and only a handful were injured. There were even reports of the IDF targeting medical aid workers. In 2021, after several Palestinian families were evicted from their homes in Jerusalem, in a controversy that the Israeli government maintained was just a real estate matter, but that Palestinians viewed as being part of their systematic expulsion from the Holy City, another round of violence erupted, again with most casualties being suffered by the Palestinians. This is the long history of conflict that preceded the October 7th attacks and the current Gaza war that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has conducted since. To be very clear, the October 7th attacks were not justifiable. Among the nearly 1,200 killed in the attacks, more than 60% were civilians and more than 3% children. But the war that Netanyahu has conducted since is like nothing that preceded it. Nearly 60,000 are dead in Gaza, around 80% of them civilians, and almost a third of them children. Though Hamas must be condemned for its crimes against humanity, the history of the conflict clearly justifies those who protest on behalf of the Palestinian people, who in the last 75 years have had their homes taken from them, have been displaced, occupied, and kept in abject poverty, and who now face utter annihilation in Gaza. Indeed, if more people advocated for them, perhaps so many would not feel that Hamas is the only one in their corner. Sam Harris argues that the history of this conflict is irrelevant because he sees it as a struggle between jihadism and open societies, that the only important thing is what each side fights for. As many do, he sees anti-Semitism and genocide in the hearts of all Palestinians, and devotion to secular pluralism and equal rights in the hearts of all Israelis. If he took a broader view of history, though, he would surely acknowledge that anti-Semitism is not foundational to Islam, and therefore not inherent in all Muslim peoples. Indeed, anti-Semitism was largely a colonial import, introduced to Islam by Christians. First, in the Byzantine Empire, Jews were second-class citizens, treated like heretics and pagans. Throughout the Middle Ages, we see the worst of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories develop in Europe, the blood libel and the plague scapegoating. Meanwhile, the Quran is not an inherently anti-Semitic text. Jews are portrayed mostly very sympathetically within it. Indeed, Muhammad admired Jews and adopted their customs, to the point that up until the 7th century, Muslims prayed toward Jerusalem, not Mecca. Anti-Semitic hate was introduced to Islamic culture perhaps first in French Algeria, where the French colonial government encouraged Jewish scapegoating and persecution during the Damascus affair, in which the Jewish community was blamed for the disappearance of a Christian monk based on the false blood libel claim that Jews all secretly collect and use Christian blood in profane ceremonies. The affair involved the torture and execution of Jews, as well as pogroms perpetrated by mobs of Christians and Muslims doing violence against Jews together. Another way that European colonialism contributed to anti-Semitism in the Middle East was in the way that they turned colonized people against each other, a common tactic of the colonizer. For example, not that many years after the Damascus affair, French authorities granted Jews citizenship, but not Muslims, further cultivating Islamic resentment of Jews. Certainly in Palestine, resentment grew because of colonial powers favoring the Jews over the Muslims there. And perhaps the worst anti-Semitic import, the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion hoax, was brought to the Middle East by Christians and propagated there, until finally an Arabic translation appeared in the 1920s, leading to its perennial popularity among Muslims who had been taught by then for decades to hate the Jews. One can even argue that Palestinian anti-Semitism was inflamed directly by the Nazis, as Palestinian nationalist leader Mohammed Amin al-Husseini, a fierce anti-Zionist during the British Mandate, met with Hitler seeking Nazi support for Palestine in 1941, and ended up living in Berlin for years. The fact that Arab anti-Semitism appears to have developed only recently in the 19th century as a result of contact with European anti-Semitism tends to support the post-colonialist view of the Israel-Palestine conflict, which considers the establishment of Israel itself as an inherently colonial project of the UK, and Israel's expansion since its subjugation of the Palestinian populations already in the region, pushing them out and settling their land and insisting that it was actually a, quote, land without a people, end quote, as textbook colonialism. Indeed, we can see a clear parallel between Israeli expansion and conflict with Palestinians and American dispossession, displacement, and genocide of Native Americans. However, the post-colonialist view of the situation does not suffice, in my view, in small part because there is no viable or realistic resolution wherein Israelis simply give up their claim to the land and go home, like the French leaving Algeria, but in larger part, the colonialist conception of the Israel-Palestine conflict simply does not take into account the uniqueness of the situation and the legitimacy of Jewish connection to the region. While historical context provides further perspective on the conflict, it also provides perspective on the establishment of the State of Israel, not as a colonial project, but rather as a legitimate restoration of an indigenous people to their ancestral homeland. It is sometimes asserted that Jews have no legitimate claim to Israel being their ancestral home beyond religious stories, which can easily be dismissed as fairy tales. But the history of the Jewish people in the Levant goes all the way back to the Iron Age, when Semitic tribes dwelled in the land then called Canaan. The biblical narrative that these tribes came out of Egypt and took the land from the Canaanites is not supported beyond these religious traditions, but the presence of Semitic peoples in the Levant who differentiated themselves from the Canaanites has definitive archaeological support. And then there is 3,000 years of continuous history placing the Israelites there, confirmed by further archaeological evidence and non-biblical ancient texts from a variety of sources, such as the inscriptions on Egyptian and Syrian stelae, throughout which time the land has remained a central focus of Jewish cultural and spiritual life. During this confirmed history, the Jewish people were many times the victims of conquest and exile. After its division into a northern kingdom of Israel and a southern kingdom of Judah, the northern kingdom was conquered by the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and this is confirmed by Mesopotamian texts. The people of the northern kingdom were exiled, some of them the lost tribes never to be seen again. Then the southern kingdom of Judah, whose capital was Jerusalem, was captured by the Neo-Babylonian Empire, a siege likewise recorded in independent sources. And the subsequent destruction of Jerusalem as described in the Bible has been confirmed by archaeological evidence. What followed was the Babylonian captivity, when Jews were again deported from their homeland. When Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon, many Jewish exiles finally returned to their homeland and rebuilt their temple. Alexander the Great was the next conqueror to take the land in seizing the Persian Empire. And after his death, control of Judea, as the Jewish homeland came to be known, was passed between the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Macedonia and the Seleucid Empire of Syria, while the Jewish populations in exile dispersed westward to many Greek and Latin-speaking lands in what is called the diaspora. Many of these Jewish refugees never even knew a homeland, but they would always consider Judea to be their place of origin, one to which they longed to eventually return. For the first time in more than 400 years, Jews achieved independence again in Jerusalem in the 2nd century BCE, when the Maccabean revolt drove out the Syrians, a victory celebrated yearly at Hanukkah. Under the Maccabeans' Hasmonean dynasty, they even expanded from Jerusalem to retake ancient Israelite kingdoms, including the territories now called Gaza and the West Bank. But in quick succession, Roman general Pompey conquered the Hasmonean kingdom. Then the Parthians took Judea from Rome, and finally Romans took it back again. For centuries afterward, the Jews who remained in Judea under Roman rule endured many repressions and attempted numerous revolts, until finally Rome drove them out of their ancestral home again, northward this time into Galilee, where they would remain during the Byzantine era. In the 7th century came the Arab conquest of what was by then no longer called Judea, but rather Syria-Palestine. And for 13 centuries, Jews in Palestine fared well under the rule of Islamic regimes, except during the Crusades, when European crusaders massacred them right along with Arabs. Long has a return to their homeland and a restoration of the nation of Israel been a central desire of the Jewish faith. Since late antiquity, Jews have prayed for Jerusalem's restoration 3 times a day, and every Passover meal ends with the phrase, "Next year in Jerusalem." At the risk of advocating an ideology of Jewish exceptionalism, I do think that the world must recognize the unique history of the Jews, conquered and exiled from their homeland time and time again throughout history, subjected to hatred, false accusations, scapegoating, and violence wherever they went. Palestine was a destination for global Jewish migration even as far back as the 15th century, when Jews expelled from Spain returned home to Palestine under Ottoman rule and built thriving communities. By the late 19th century, they were a majority of Jerusalem's population, even if they were a minority throughout Palestine. With the commencement of the Zionist project, the influx of Jews to Palestine increased, and it seemed their long-held dream of a restoration was at hand. And during World War II, some 60,000 Jews came to mandatory Palestine fleeing Nazi persecution. Finally, it must never be forgotten that during the years leading up to the end of the British Mandate, the Holocaust occurred, and afterward, Holocaust survivors came in droves to the long-promised State of Israel. President Harry Truman specifically cited the Holocaust as his reason for recognizing Israel as an independent state.
I also antagonized a lot of people by recognizing the State of Israel as soon as it was formed. Well, I had been to Potsdam, and I'd seen some of the places where the Jews had been slaughtered by the Nazis. 6 million Jews were killed outright, men, women, and children, by the Nazis. And it was my hope that they would have a homeland where they could operate.
This is the history that informs Zionism, which started as, and for many remains, a secular project to ensure security and self-determination for a people who have historically been denied it and no longer believed themselves safe in any other country. It disproves claims that Israel has no historical ties to the land, or, as some claim, no right to exist. And it weakens characterizations of Zionism as nothing more than settler colonialism. They have undeniable claims to the land as their ancestral home, but Palestinian ties to the land are just as ancient, with direct archaeological, genealogical, and genetic data proving their descent from ancient Canaanites. But as Harry Truman also made clear, even while defending the dispossession of Palestinians,
we set up the Israeli government in Palestine, moved some of the Arabs out, and they were not moved out and thrown out. They were compensated for the land that they had to give up.
there has always been an element of Zionism that not only wants a Jewish homeland, but also would deny Palestinians the same right to exist that they claim for themselves.
We had several other people in the country, even among the Jews, the Zionists particularly, who were against anything that was to be done if they couldn't have the whole of Palestine and everything handed to them on a silver plate so they wouldn't have to do anything. It couldn't be done. We had to take it in small doses. You can't move 5 or 6 million people out of a country and fill it up with 5 or 6 million more and expect both sets of them to be pleased. We had all sorts of objections to everything that was done. Something had to be done. We went ahead and done it, and had it done, and now it's working out. Eventually, I think we'll have them all satisfied, but it's going to take a great deal of time yet to get the job done.
Some criticize the entire idea of a right to exist, dismissing it as nothing but nationalism when Israel claims it, and denying that any country has a right to exist. But I believe that the concept of a nation's right to exist, which is closely related to a people's right to self-determination, can be upheld without advocating nationalist ideology. The denial of a nation's right to exist sometimes goes hand in hand with genocidal intent, as was the case recently with Putin's denial of Ukraine's right to exist. The Palestinian cause can also be characterized as a struggle for the right to exist, in that it is a struggle for sovereignty and self-determination. And denial of these by ultra-nationalist Israelis has contributed to the unfolding genocide in Gaza. We should, therefore, affirm both Israel's and Palestine's right to exist, which is the only path forward to a two-state solution, the long elusive proposal for peace in the region that the Palestinian Authority still supports, but that Netanyahu's radical far-right regime currently rejects. Unlike the Heritage Foundation and the Trump regime, we can think about this critically and logically, as many are doing, despite the characterization of them by Project Esther and the ultra-right-wing zealots running our country. We can advocate for the Palestinian people without supporting Hamas, just as we can criticize the actions of Israel without engaging in anti-Semitism or denying Israel's right to exist. We must recognize that criticism of the Netanyahu regime is not criticism of all Israelis. In fact, it is actually anti-Semitic to suggest that all Israelis support what's happening in Gaza, just as it is anti-Semitic to suggest that all American Jews must vote based on loyalty to the Netanyahu regime, as Trump has explicitly said.
You vote for a Democrat, you're being very disloyal to Jewish people, and you're being very disloyal to Israel.
As of March this year, 70% of Israelis actually want Netanyahu to resign. Politics change. The Overton window shifts. While Sam Harris views Israel as a representative of secular pluralism standing against the evils of jihadism, the fact is that Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition government is the result of a long rightward creep toward ethnocracy and theocracy, with the aim of controlling the Supreme Court, flouting law, and destroying liberal democratic institutions. If that doesn't sound familiar, it should. This drift to the right toward authoritarianism followed the example of democratic erosions elsewhere, in Hungary, Poland, and Turkey, and we're seeing it now in America as well. In Israel, it started with Kahanism, the teachings of Jewish supremacist Meir Kahane, whose ideology, as I mentioned previously, inspired the deadly Hebron Mosque massacre. His political party was outlawed in the 80s, but neo-Kahanist groups survive today. The ruling right-wing Likud party now accommodates these racist neo-Kahanist parties along with other radical religious parties in its coalition, meaning that this government is largely devoted not only to rejecting a two-state solution, driving out Palestinians, and putting Israeli settlements in every territory, but also to stamping out liberal, feminist, and LGBTQ+ influence in the country. And Netanyahu is their Trump, their strongman who will centralize power and disregard norms in order to finally bring about their goals. Israel used to be closer to peace with Palestine when, under Yitzhak Rabin, the Oslo Accords were signed. At that time, Netanyahu was the leader of the Likud opposition, and his extremist rhetoric, many believe, encouraged Rabin's assassination. During his own terms of leadership, Netanyahu actually had suitcases of cash delivered to Hamas, hoping to prop them up and thereby divide and conquer the Palestinian Authority. When Hamas succeeded in taking Gaza, as he had apparently hoped, he immediately applied a stranglehold blockade. And with every retaliation, he has escalated the retaliatory violence, as I have already described. While many in Israel protest this violence, Netanyahu is beholden to the radicals in his party. many of whom view the story of Esther as a license to commit genocide, to exterminate any who they fear want to exterminate them. And it is no exaggeration, no anti-Semitic slur to call the current Gaza war a genocide. As I said in a previous episode, under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, ratified by the US and Israel, along with 151 other states, genocide is defined as killing, quote, with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, end quote, or, quote, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part, end quote. Due to Israel's indiscriminate bombing and pattern of disproportionate civilian harm, and apparently purposeful creation of famine by denying the access of aid convoys, the United Nations, Amnesty International, Doctors Without Borders, and Human Rights Watch, along with other major international watchdog organizations, have officially recognized Netanyahu's Gaza war as an unfolding genocide. It should no longer be controversial to call it what it is. You'll hear defenders of Netanyahu's radical government and the IDF engage in whataboutism, claiming it's only anti-Semitism that has led to the labeling of the Gaza war as genocide, because there has not been equally vocal denouncements of ongoing genocides in Myanmar, Sudan, Iraq, China, Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere. But that is like saying we shouldn't say Black Lives Matter because all lives matter. Yes, there are unfolding genocides elsewhere. Yes, they too should be stopped. That does not change the fact that the Gaza war is a genocide that we must condemn. I'm only sorry I haven't used my platform to do so until now. Thanks for listening to Historical Blindness. As always, special thanks go out to my partner patrons, Diane Lane, Robert Fisher, Joe Escott, Devlin Hoff, Lisa, Prickly Pear, Fred R. Grotice, Robin Naggett, Maddie Kinney, Rebecca, Don Mundus, Eunice Allen Bradley, Juliet O'Connor, Jonathan Williams, Joshua Luddington, Christine LeBlanc, Lonnie C., Kaylee, Ama, Christopher L. Burton, Benny Slater, That One Girl, Chris, Jocelyn Clausen, Lindsay McAllister, an anonymous patron, Brian, CPJ MLT LTD, Jamie Nielsen, Wizard in a Tower, and Martin Robusto. Thank you for listening to and supporting this podcast, even when you may agree or disagree with views I've expressed. I know you patrons recognize that I always intend to get it right, to support what's right and true. As my biggest supporters, please rate and review me and follow me on social media. On TikTok, for example, my posts regularly get bombarded by right-wing hate. I'd love to see the support of my listeners there. And YouTube, as I'm hoping to expand the work I do on this podcast with video content this summer. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows, like The Constant and Who Did What Now. Some music on this episode was licensed through a Blue Dot Sessions blanket license at the time of the episode's publication. Additional music is by Kai Engel and by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Check out the show notes for a list of the tracks used. You can support the show by pledging on Patreon or by making a one-time donation on PayPal. Find those links in the show notes, or find me on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Until next time, when it comes to questions about support for and entanglement in foreign wars, remember the appeal to tradition fallacy, argumentum ad antiquitatem. Just because we have long provided military aid and economic aid without regard to how it is used, doesn't mean a reassessment of that practice can never be warranted.
Have you ever gazed in wonder at the Great Pyramid? Have you marveled at the golden face of Tutankhamun? Or admired the delicate features of Queen Nefertiti? If you have, you'll probably like the History of Egypt podcast. Every week, we explore tales of this ancient culture. The History of Egypt is available wherever you get your podcasting fix. Come, let me introduce you to the world of ancient Egypt.
Have you ever thought about what would happen if your airline window popped out? Or if you could build a jetpack using only machine guns? Turns out you can, but you really shouldn't. Hi, I'm Jill Chacha, host of a podcast that's for weird people who like learning about weird stuff. It's called Well, That's Interesting, and it's a comedy science-y show that tells the story behind the facts because, as it turns out, those stories are funny. The facts are bizarre, the stories are epic, and the laughter is plentiful. So, join the flock and listen to Well, That's Interesting wherever you do podcasts.